Hello and welcome. Thank you for being with us today for our webinar on the Black Madonna for Racial Liberation with Dr. Christena Cleveland. We are at the end of our pilgrimage, our webinar series on the pilgrimage for healing and liberation. You can, if you want to go back and watch our previous webinars, you can find them at medieval.nd.edu/pilgrimage. And we are very excited for our culminating event today. I want to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, which our co-sponsors are the Initiative on Race and Resilience here at Notre Dame, the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts, and the Departments of Africana Studies and Theology, as well as the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's College. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Larissa Harrington, who will then introduce our speaker. And we invite you to ask questions, which we'll field after our speaker's presentation today. So in the Q&A function, you can type your questions and Larissa will field those later in the hour. Our moderator, Larissa Harrington, is a fourth-year doctoral student in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame. Larissa is from Tolono, Illinois. She holds bachelor's degrees in psychology and social work from Greenville College and is a graduate of Emory University's Candler School of Theology, where she completed her Master of Divinity, concentrating in Catholic studies. Her areas of research include the role of Mary in devotional and popular piety, womanist theology, eschatology as it relates to the historical and contemporary conditions of diasporic Africans, ritual studies, and sacramental theology. Larissa is writing a dissertation called Theorizing Diaspora, Recovering the Fragments of the Black Madonna in the Americas. And she's working on the retrieval of the image of the Black Madonna as she has appeared throughout Christian history, exploring the cultural and religious significance of Mary and Marian embodiment and enculturation for diasporic Africans in the Americas. So Larissa, over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Annie. And I am equally excited to introduce our speaker today, who also is a scholar, activist, who is enamored, just as I am, with the image of the Black Madonna. So, Dr. Christena Cleveland, Ph.D., is a social psychologist, public theologian, author, and activist. She is the founder and director of the Center for Justice Renewal, as well as its sister organization, Sacred Folk, which creates resources to stimulate people's spiritual imaginations and support their journeys toward liberation. An award-winning researcher and former professor at Duke University's Divinity School, Dr. Cleveland currently lives in Boston, Massachusetts. So if you could all welcome Dr. Cleveland today. Dr. Cleveland, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Larissa. It's such a joy to be here. And I want to open our short time together with a poem. And so I'm going to just read it. And then it's a short poem and I'll read it again. So just allow it to wash over you and notice any changes that might happen in your body. Here's the poem. Hire her for your children, for your kitchen, for your clothes, for your house. Give her a room with an unmade twin bed and a dresser, an alarm clock. Set her hours past her own children's bedtime. Shorten her name, change her name, talk through her, call her a part of the family without ever asking if she wants you this close to her skin. Just do not be surprised the day you accidentally look in her eyes and her spirit pulls your heart out through your mouth. That poem is called The Maid, and it's by Nayera Wahid. I'll read it one more time. Hire her for your children, for your clothes, for your kitchen, for your house. Give her a room with an unmade twin bed and a dresser, an alarm clock, set her hours past her own children's bedtime, shorten her name, change her name, talk through her, call her a part of the family without ever asking if she wants you this close to her skin. Just do not be surprised the day you accidentally look in her eyes and her spirit pulls your heart out through your mouth. That's The Maid by Nahira Wahim. Now, if you're anything like me, when I first read that poem a few years ago, even though Wahid doesn't mention race at all in this context of The Maid, it's pretty easy, at least it was very easy for me, to automatically imagine what this maid looked like. This maid who's not even really given a name, her own name in this poem. And I was also able to imagine the context, including the people who were doing the naming, who were telling her that she had to be more devoted to their children than to her own children, who were taking up space in her personal space, who were forcing her to be close to them or far from them, all on their whims, all on their needs. The people who did the hiring, the people who did the naming. And if you're anything like me, my first thought was, this is one of my grandmothers who were domestic servants in white homes, this maid. Or perhaps you're like me and you imagine someone who was a Black or brown woman who was an immigrant to the United States. Perhaps English is not her first language. Perhaps it is. Either way, my imagination automatically came alive, even though there's no description of this maid and there's no description of the family that's naming her and hiring her. But again, my imagination filled with a family of white people. That was what I automatically thought when I saw that. And I think that's one of the really brilliant things about this particular poem and about a lot of Wahid's work is that she really calls attention to our sociological imaginations. She calls attention to the ways in which we have been programmed, the ways in which we have been influenced, manipulated by colonialism, by anti-Blackness, and by a number of other things that relate to this poem. And what's so powerful for me in her not naming race is that she's showing us that this is part of the stew that we're living in. And even though I have never worked as a maid, even though I have a lot of class privilege relative to most maids, maybe all maids, even though I'm not an immigrant to the United States and English is my first language, there's a big part of me that as a Black woman could relate to that particular story of the maid, of being named and not being allowed to name myself, of people questioning my schedule and feeling like they have access to my schedule in ways that didn't affirm my sovereignty. And as an academic, I experienced this being named. And what's really interesting about the sociological imagination, and one of the reasons why I'm really glad I'm a social scientist and also someone in the humanities and theology, is because I've discovered over my research and my work that our sociological imaginations really powerfully infuse our theological imaginations as well. And when I say theological imagination, I don't mean just systematic theology that would show up in a textbook. And I don't mean just the sort of theology that would be pontificated from a lecture, from a lectern in a course, or from a lectern in an established church or some other sacred space, an institutional sacred space. When I say theological imagination, I mean it more informally in the ways that it just shows up in our world, kind of in the way that race shows up in this poem without it being named. And when I talk about theological imagination, it's really about what does our society say is sacred and what is profane? More to the point, who is sacred and who is profane? Whose life matters and whose life doesn't matter? Whose voice matters? Whose testimony matters? and whose doesn't? Whose moral perspective is centered and taken seriously and whose isn't? And as a Black woman growing up in the United States, I was awakening to this reality. I was awakening to the reality that however our society conceptualized theological imagination or who is sacred and who is not, I was on the outside of that. And my awakening came somewhat late in life. And after many years of being an academic and being in the world and being a quote unquote grown up, I grew up in a pretty conservative Pentecostal denomination, Black Pentecostal denomination with sort of an adjacent connection to white evangelicalism. And so I grew up in the church, but I didn't really start thinking about theological imagination in this way, think specifically beyond just what would show up in a book until I was in my early 30s when Trayvon Martin was shot and killed by George Zimmerman in 2012. And I remember being a professor at the time, having done all my social psychology education and installed as a professor somewhere, and realizing for the first time that I hadn't thought critically about the ways that I had inherited this theological imagination, this theological imagination that says that this little Black boy is not worthy of life simply because he's a little Black boy who in some way felt threatening to this white man. And I was at the time already working in reconciliation, which was the area that I was working, racial reconciliation. And so I was surrounded by all sorts of people who claimed to care about race, particularly in religious spaces. But when Black people began a national conversation, because of social media and because of news outlets, this was probably the first national conversation that we had around race in my adulthood. I remember being a kid and Rodney King happening and O.J. Simpson happening, and there being national conversations around race. But as an adult, this was the first one. And to see so many people in my communities who were not Black, unwilling to hear the Black voices that were speaking out about the injustice of this incident, of this murder, really awakened me. And I thought, wow, I've been growing up with this implicit image of a white Christ, and I'm starting to see that my theological imagination has been impacted by my sociological imagination. And so I started looking for images of a Black Christ. And I started speaking and writing and researching the Black Christ because I saw that in America's spiritual imagination, there was no sacredness for Blackness. I could see that playing out on a national level. Blackness was not sacred because my hypothesis was because the Christ, the God, was not Black. The God was white, the opposite of Blackness. And so I spent the next several years writing, speaking, traveling, doing a lot of work around race and spiritual imagination in the United States, particularly within Protestant communities. And I was focused on that. I mean, oftentimes as a Black woman, I have to choose what I'm going to focus on. And sometimes it's race and sometimes it's gender. I'm not always allowed to show up as both in every space. And so I was focused on the Black Christ, and I was focused on Black Jesus and the problem of white Jesus, the historical inaccuracy of white Jesus, but also how it had poisoned our theological and sociological imaginations. And it made it really difficult for us to see Blackness as sacred, to see the image of the divine in Blackness itself, as theologian James Cone invited us to in so much of his writing. And then, so I was focused on Blackness, not thinking at all about the divine's gender or sexuality. And then Trump happened. And now at this time, it's, fast forward from 2012, which was when Trayvon Martin was killed, to 2016-ish. And at the time, Trump's running for election. I'm a professor at Duke Divinity School. I'm also the director of the Center for Reconciliation. So I had all sorts of experience with race and not a lot around gender. And when Trump was running and saying racist and xenophobic things, I was not really fazed by the Christian response, the sort of mainstream Christian response, which was to defend him. I wasn't surprised by that because I had been working as the director of the Center for Reconciliation at Duke, and I knew firsthand how much racism exists within a lot of religious spaces in the United States, not just within Christian and Protestant spaces. And so I wasn't surprised. But closer to the actual election in the fall of 2016, when President Trump, then the nominee, started talking about how he had sexually assaulted white women, I thought, okay, finally, Christians are going to say something about this, because if there was anything I knew in my work was that Blackness wasn't necessarily sacred, but white femininity was very sacred within a lot of Christian spaces. And there was a lot of circling the wagons and support for white femininity. And so I was shocked when the Protestant Christian Church in America came behind President Trump and said, we're actually going to affirm him. We're going to still vote for him. We're going to still see him as our leader, despite this language that he's using around women and his behaviors around women. And that's when I had an intersectional moment. And I realized the problem isn't just white Jesus. The problem is also exclusively male Jesus. And so at that moment, in really desperation, which as I've learned in so much more research around the Black Madonna and the stories of the people who have loved her across the centuries, many people find the Black Madonna out of desperation. She's known for that. And I can share some stories in our question and response time if people are interested in that. But the Black Madonna arose in that time because I was specifically looking for an image of the divine that could heal my theological imagination and potentially heal others' theological imaginations around who is sacred in our society. And it started with a Google search, but as soon as I saw the first image that came up in, late 2016, as I was searching frantically, my entire body chemistry changed, and I realized I had been holding in my breath my whole life. I feel like I exhaled for the first time when I saw one image of the Black Madonna, and I saw this sacred icon that was thousands of years old, that people from all over the world, different geographies, different religious backgrounds, different races, different creeds, had all venerated over time. And I realized in that moment, in that exhale, that I had been holding in questions my whole life. As a good girl, as a stay in her lane, good academic, trying to get tenure, as a good Protestant girl who's a pastor's daughter, I realized there had been questions bubbling up within me that I hadn't been allowed to ask. And I started to ask those questions, like, why does white patriarchy get to create God in its own image? If God is white and male, then how can a Black woman like me ever be truly sacred? Again, speaking to that theological imagination that we have. And I didn't realize this until years after I started researching the Black Madonna, but Bell Hooks wrote in 2016 that she was urging African Americans like myself to find the Black Madonna and claim the Black Madonna. And this is what she wrote. Unfortunately, African Americans have not been interested in reclaiming representations of Black Madonnas. And this is a sensitive point, she writes, because most constructions of Black femaleness are tied to representations that are hateful and ugly. So the idea of an icon that can stand in resistance becomes further and further away. And in that moment of recognizing that as a Black person and as a woman, I was under siege in this society, I longed for an icon of resistance. And that's what the Black Madonna became for me, this icon of resistance that can untangle the constructions of Black femaleness that are tied to representations that are hateful and ugly, and can open up and heal my theological imagination so that I'm not only affirming the sacredness of myself, but I'm affirming the sacredness of all people, including all Black women, including Black trans women. And so a complete reversal of what I had been programmed into in our society, where God is white and male. It's on the money. It's on a dollar bill. It says, "In God we trust," right below George Washington, who was a slave-holding white Protestant male. And so as I awakened to the Black Madonna and I awakened to this icon of resistance, I started to notice more about how constructions of Black femaleness are often tied to representations that are hateful and ugly. And I was able to pick this up in my academic work. And so not long after I first encountered the Black Madonna, I was speaking at Cambridge University. I was giving a lecture there, and I was brought in by a specific institute at Cambridge that's named after a really famous theologian. And they asked me specifically, they said, "Dr. Cleveland, we want you to come and we want your lecture to address the implicit racism and colonialism in this scholar's work." And I thought they were serious when they invited me to do that. And so I came and I gave the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, the first person whose hand popped up in the Q&A was a man who said, right off the bat, "I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous." And he was so angry, you could see his entire body was like in a ball. And that was not unlike many of the people in that space, particularly the white and male people. They were very upset that I had, burst their bubble about the perfection of this scholar. Of course, he had really wonderful contributions. And also, he was doing a lot of work in a time where there was a lot of rampant racism and colonialism going on. And so I was sharing about how his work was influenced by that, how his theological imagination was influenced by the sociological imagination at the time. And this person responded not with a legitimate critique, and it wasn't a perfect lecture. There's no such thing as a perfect lecture. And so, of course, there were legitimate questions and critiques to what I had shared, but he didn't have a question or critique. He just said, "I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous." And I immediately recognized that this is one of the representations of Black femaleness that Bell Hooks was talking about. I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous. I can't tell if you're sloppy or lazy or stupid like Black people are. And I can't tell if you're mischievous, if you're cunning, if you're untrustworthy, if you're easily deceived like women are. Just like that, he had combined my identities as Black and female in one slur. I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous. And so experiences like that really, really invited me to double down on my pursuit of the Black Madonna. And I got really serious about who is this icon? What is her history? And who are the people who have been drawn to her? And how have they been drawn to her? And as soon as I opened the lid of that question, the resources and the information started coming through. And these are not resources that are easy to find, but they are out there to be found if we look for them. And now there's so many more scholars and practitioners who are bringing a lot of these resources into like a little bit more of a mainstream conversation, which I'm also really grateful for my colleagues who are sharing in this work with me. But one of the things I first discovered about the Black Madonna is that embodiment is a big part of the way that people have been connected to her. She is one of the number one pilgrim drawers in the history of religion, honestly, specifically within the Christian context. And so across the centuries, Black Madonna shrines have been significantly overrepresented amongst the most popular Marian shrines. Now, the vast majority of Marian shrines are of white Marys, because the vast majority of Marys in the world are white. You can thank colonialism for that, because certainly the earliest shrines to Mary were not white. She was Black and or brown exclusively for hundreds of years, and then she became white. But now, if you look around, for every one Black Madonna, who knows what the number is, but there are probably thousands of white Madonnas, because there are only about 450 official Black Madonnas in the world. But what's interesting about Black Madonnas, and speaks to the power that they have as pilgrimage sites, is that Black Madonna pilgrimage sites across history have been incredibly popular. They're the most popular pilgrimage sites across history, particularly within the Christian context, have been more often than not, have been Black Madonna sites. The Black Madonna of Montserrat is the second most visited pilgrimage site in the history of Christian pilgrimage, only behind the Camino de Santiago. That's the only pilgrimage site or journey that's more popular than the Black Madonna of Montserrat. And so when we start to look at how people have been drawn across oceans, across continents, in order to not just know about her or to see a picture of her, but to actually be with her, then we start getting invited into a lot of feminist and or divine feminine theology that really brings into conversation the body. And one of the things that I started learning as I drew closer and closer to the Black Madonna is that she's interested in the wisdom that comes from our body. And there's stories after stories after stories of people who were affirmed that their perspective, their need, their embodied need was what mattered to her. And you see this in many of the names of the Black Madonnas that speak to the land or speak to the body. There are Black Madonnas called like Slave Mama, and that particular Black Madonna is in solidarity with people who are physically in chains. There are Black Madonnas that speak to health and to sickness. And so there's a lot of work around the Black Madonna that shows that she's really interested in our bodies. Now, this was tricky for me because at the time when I first started awakening to this path, I was a professor and I only knew how to think. And so I was thinking, I was wondering, how do I start to understand the ways that people have been drawn to this Black Madonna in a way that isn't a TED Talk? Because that's kind of all I knew to do. We started studying for the SATs when I was in first grade. And my parents are extremely intellectual, and that's not a bad thing. But I only knew how to essentially give a TED Talk about the Black Madonna. I didn't know how to personally experience the Black Madonna, at least not intentionally. I do remember the first time encountering the Black Madonna. And like I said, my body chemistry changed. I exhaled, my entire body exhaled. So I knew that my response to her was similar to what other people's were, but I knew I had a lot of work to do, because I had this very linear, intellectual, academic brain that was drowning out the voice of my body. And so I started doing a lot of work on decolonizing my body, on embodiment, on connecting my head and my heart, and connecting my thoughts with my emotions. And it was through that work, mindfulness practices, somatics, the whole thing, trauma therapy, that I realized that I wanted to go see the Black Madonna, just like people have for hundreds of years, thousands of years. I wanted to make a pilgrimage, and I knew that was going to become a really big part of my work, is not just reading about the Black Madonna, but going and visiting the Black Madonna and allowing her image, her iconic image, to infuse my theological imagination and also my theological writing. And thankfully, I didn't have to make up this way of doing theology. I was at the time getting really connected to womanist theology, which is very embodied, and it's very based in not just what tradition says or not what consensus says or not what can be distilled into a TED Talk, but it's what's coming up in Black women's bodies and in their voices and in their experiences. And what does that say about who is sacred and what is profane? What does that say about the divine? What does that say about morality and need and community? These deeply theological questions. And so I decided to go on a pilgrimage, and I decided to make it a walking pilgrimage. Again, this desire to connect with my body, to connect with the land. I wanted to be able to walk to Black Madonnas and say, I walked 10, 12, 15 miles to come see you. And I met dozens of people who loved you and whose grandmothers loved you. And I've walked along this earth that you're also connected to and has surrounded you for all these years. That's what I wanted to be able to do. And so in 2018, for the first time, I went on the first of many Black Madonna pilgrimages, and I walked 400 miles across central France in the Auvergne region. And I got to visit 18 Black Madonnas on that particular journey. And we don't have a lot of time today, but I encourage you to read more about my journeys online or in my book. But I will tell you about 2 Black Madonnas that I met while walking. And yeah, they're all really special to me, and they've all really impacted my theology and my research. But I'll tell you, the first one that I want to share is called Our Lady of the Sick. She's the Black Madonna of Vichy, France. Now, if you're a World War II buff, you might recognize that name, Vichy, France. Vichy is actually a really tiny town of maybe only about 30 or 50,000 people, and it's in the middle of France. But it was the puppet capital of France during World War II. And the French government that was cooperating with Nazi Germany was installed in Vichy. And so I knew a little bit about the town through that history, but I didn't know that it had a Black Madonna until I started looking for Black Madonnas in the area and walking to them. And this particular Black Madonna is astounding. Her body is made of walnut. Her body is only a couple hundred years old. Her head is a lot older. It might date back to the 1300s when she was first installed. But she's a Black Madonna who was wildly famous in her heyday. And because of her, and because of the fact that she was discovered right next to a healing spring, she began to be called Our Lady of the Sick. And she was known throughout North Africa, what we would now call Southwestern Asia, and into the Mediterranean areas of France and Spain and others. She was sort of globally known in that world as the person to go to, the divine being to go to if you have an ailment that cannot be fixed. And so particularly people who didn't have access to good healthcare at the time, would walk hundreds of miles to come to dip in her water in the healing spring and to pray to her. And so she was incredibly, incredibly famous. And the whole city of Vichy sprung up around her because she was drawing so many people. And it became kind of this like thermal spa town, which is what it still is today. And during the French Revolution, she, like many Black Madonnas, were destroyed because they were connected to the church, which the church was connected to the elite. And so the revolution was against all of that. And many Black Madonnas were destroyed then, including her. But women from the city of Vichy who loved her tracked down the revolutionaries who tried to destroy her body and retrieved her head, just her head. And they were able to bring her head back to Vichy. And over the next few years, they built her a new body. So that's why her head is several hundred years older than the rest of her body. But this speaks so much to me. The image of her, the reality of her story speaks so much to me about the way that colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy have disconnected my heart and my body from my head, and the embodiment work that I was doing on that very pilgrimage to reconnect with my own body, to reconnect with the land in ways that Black women's bodies have been disconnected from the land due to enslavement, due to domestic servitude, due to environmental racism. This Black Madonna standing before me when I walked to her one day could relate to this decapitation that I was experiencing, that I was trying to heal from. And one of my beloved teachers, Kelsey Blackwell, who's an incredible scholar practitioner, just wrote a book that came out March 1st called Decolonizing the Body, speaks to this dismemberment that many of us experience in our decolonized bodies. And she describes the way that the program of colonization works to separate us from our truth, to literally dismember us, to separate us from the memory of our deeper truths, just like this Black Madonna had been separated, her head from her body. And on my journey to discover the Black Madonna, to research the Black Madonna, to understand in a more personal way how other people have approached the Black Madonna, I did exactly what Kelsey Blackwell suggests in her book, Decolonizing the Body. She writes this: the program functions, this colonial program functions through two kinds of dismemberment. It makes us forget the power, wisdom, and liberation residing in our own bodies. And it also erases the dignity of our ancestors. If the program is Sankofa, then we can meet it with Sankofa. Sorry, if the program is dismemberment, we meet it with Sankofa, which is remembering. Remembering means reconnecting with our own physical bodies, literally remembering our bodies, as well as the wisdom of our people and remembering the wisdom of our people. It's through this remembering or connecting with the intelligence that lives below the head that we are able to remember the wise ways of our ancestors. It is through this remembering or connecting with the intelligence that lives below the head that we are able to remember the wise ways of our ancestors. In my very pilgrimage, I was doing this work of remembering without even really knowing the significance of that in the colonial and in the work of, I'm so sorry, I just dropped something. In the work of anti-colonial research, I didn't even know at the time that this is what I was doing because I wasn't aware of that research, that embodiment research. But just by following the stories of what other people had done with the Black Madonna, I was invited into that remembering. And it was so powerful to stand before Our Lady of the Sick, who had been decapitated like me, and yet had been pieced back together, lovingly pieced back together over years. I was able to be honest with her and to infuse my own theology with this idea that it's very extremely liberating in the white patriarchal context in which I was living and also working at Duke. And I was able to share with her and also realize that my dismemberment actually is something that I can bring forward. I don't have to hide it. I don't have to keep everything in this TED Talk format that feels clean and linear and consistent and going along with tradition. I can actually be a little bit messy. I can be a little bit dismembered. I can be I can be a mess and still be sacred. And that in that conversation with her and in that time with her and in my subsequent writings about her, I realized that one of the things that I had inherited in this more white patriarchal theological imagination was that in order to be valuable, I had to be perfect. In order to be valuable, I had to be whole, quote unquote, in a very ableist way. And so I actually nicknamed this particular Black Madonna, She Who Cherishes Our Hot Mess, because I realized that at the heart of who she was as Our Lady of the Sick was someone who was actually inviting all people to come as they were, as they are, without needing to put on masks. and saying to them, you are sacred too, which is the opposite of what we get in our very anti-need, anti-nurturing society. Usually the more we share honestly about where we're at, the less sacred we are taught that we are. And we're taught to clean ourselves up, and that godliness is next to cleanliness. And her entire way of being in the world helped so much in dismantling some of that theological imagination that I had inherited. And another little surprise that happened on my pilgrimage was that I discovered Black Madonnas that I didn't even know existed and are almost impossible to find in the research and in online learning. And that happens because oftentimes I would be out and about and I would have conversations with people and they would say, oh, you know, my village that I grew up in 100 miles from here has a Black Madonna. Have you heard about that one? And I'm like, no, there's no record of her. I'm so glad I'm talking to you. They're like, oh yeah, my grandmother has loved her since, the 1930s. Let me connect you with this grandmother so you all can have a conversation. And so I learned so much about the history of the Black Madonna, the ways that people engage the Black Madonna. I kind of got to go on my own womanist expedition because I got to see this is how the Black Madonna is showing up in people's everyday lives. This is what she means to them. This is the icon of resistance that she stands for in this context. And similar to that, one day I happened upon a vintage and antique bookseller, and he had a book about an old book from the 1930s about the Black Madonnas not just the Black Madonnas, the Madonnas in that region. And when I flipped through his book, I saw many Black Madonnas that I had already heard of, but I also saw a few Black Madonnas that I had never heard of because this book wasn't online and I had never read it. And it was in French too. So I was just looking at pictures. And I discovered this Black Madonna that I ended up naming Our Lady of the Side-Eye, although her original traditional name is Our Lady of the Rock, and she dates to the 1100s. She's in a teeny tiny village, not even a village, a hamlet. There are only 5 families that live in this particular hamlet. This is where she lives in the middle of the mountains, the Cantal Mountains. And she lives in a little mountain chapel. She's not even in the church, the main church in the hamlet, which the hamlet does have a church because the hamlet used to be a lot bigger. And it was through connecting with this bookseller and then connecting with this book that I even discovered Our Lady of the Side-Eye. And let me tell you why I call her Our Lady of the Side-Eye, because she's very unique for a Black Madonna. I don't think I've ever seen a Black Madonna icon that has more than 2 figures in it. So sometimes the Black Madonna is the only figure in her icon. And sometimes there's another figure. It's the baby Jesus. And so usually it's one of those 2 options, just the Black Madonna or the Black Madonna and Jesus. And in this particular one, there were 3 figures. There's the Black Madonna. This image goes back to the 1100s. There's baby Jesus, who's kind of like a toddler. He's a little bit older than a lot of the Jesuses. And there's also in the statue, in the icon, a 3rd figure, and it's a white male priest who's kneeling either in supplication or prayer to the Black Madonna. And what's fascinating about this, again, this is almost 1,000 years old, this icon. What's fascinating about it is she is giving this white male priest the wildest, fiercest side eye you could ever see. And if you're a Black woman or Black women, you know that our side eye, I don't know about this, is fierce. And it says a lot about what is sacred and what is profane. It says a lot because our side eye points out the injustices in the world, the ridiculousness in the world, the lunacy in the world. And so the fact that she is looking at this, she's giving this side eye to this figure of white patriarchy, particularly religious white patriarchy, was so powerful to me. And to be affirmed in my Black female experience and recognizing like, wow, ever since the 1100s, this sacred icon has been giving the same energy that I've been giving is just unbelievable. And this idea of, this initial question that I had, if God is white and male, how can a Black woman like me ever be sacred? Was answered in her statue. Not only am I sacred, but my anger is sacred. My critique is sacred. My side eye is sacred too. It's all sacred. So that transformed, and I would never have even found her if I hadn't gone on that pilgrimage. And I ended up walking 42 miles across a winter mountain range to go see her. That was a whole nother adventure. And so I'll let you read more about that in my book. Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Cleveland, oh my gosh, I have so many questions, but I know that everyone else on the call also does. So I'll actually table my question for last so that we can get to others. But thank you so much for this beautiful and exciting presentation. Like you said, this research is not being done by very many scholars in the field. It's very new and very innovative in very many ways. So the work that you're doing is so important to the larger field of Marian studies and theology and religious studies, but also anthropology and sociology. So thank you so much for your dedication. So the first comment that I got, so this was a comment in the Q&A. It said, I've been to the Camino de Santiago, also have seen Black Madonnas there. And then we have another one related to your actual pilgrimage. So it said, Dear Dr. Cleveland, in your book, you write about walking and feeling kinship with the pilgrims who had walked those routes for centuries. Could you please talk to us about the community of pilgrims across time?
Sure. Yeah, I can give a little snapshot because from my research, I have discovered that perhaps the most diverse group of people have been drawn to the Black Madonna. But I would say in general, pilgrims were down and out. They were desperate. They didn't have access to political power. They didn't have access to monetary power. They often didn't have access, period. So, often they were Black and brown people. Often they were migrants. Often they were women. Often they were socioeconomically oppressed. A good example of someone who was really devoted to the Black Madonna is Joan of Arc. The Black Madonna of Mulan was like her favorite in the world. And she prayed to her right before she went to battle in 1429. And so often if you see folks who are either extremely disenfranchised, or they are people who are standing up in some way and standing in their power and look to the Black Madonna as an icon of resistance. So that's, yeah. And so walking, especially because I walked lots of trails, the Auvergne region is surrounded by about 40 volcanic mountains. And so a lot of my walks to these villages were on trails, and those trails used to be Roman roads. And so I was walking the actual trail that pilgrims walked.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. I did not know that about Joan of Arc. Wow. So our next question was, Dr. Cleveland, where does Mary, the Mother of God, fit into your understanding of the Black Madonna?
There are people who disagree with this, which is fine, but I would say they're one and the same. And as I've done more research on how Black Madonnas got to the region of France that I've done most of my work on the Black Madonna, many of them are said to have been brought by either Luke, the disciple of Jesus, or Mark, the disciple of Jesus, because both of them knew the historical Mary. And Luke is said to have painted a lot of the early Black Madonnas. And so he was painting Mary as he knew her, which was as a black woman or a dark-skinned woman. And then also Mark was Libyan, and he was Black himself, and he understood Mary, the Mother of God, to be a Black woman. And so if you look at research on the earliest Marian and also Christ images, up until the 3rd or 4th century, they were all black and brown, that you couldn't find a white one. And so my understanding of the Black Madonna is the continuation of the Marian images that were brought to different parts of the world.
Excellent. Thank you. And this next question is actually related to what you were just sharing with us, Dr. Cleveland. It says, would it be helpful in our study of the Black Madonna to expose Americans to the iconography of African and other global South traditions, such as Ethiopian, Coptic, etc.?
I have found it helpful for me. As soon as I started studying the Black Madonna, I realized pretty quickly, if you go just beneath the surface, you start to see that the Black Madonna statues, particularly in the region that I've done most of my work in France, are connected to spiritual traditions that predate the Catholic Church. And many of those spiritual traditions are either Coptic, they're Coptic if they're from Coptic, or Ethiopian if they're from the Christian tradition, or if they come from outside the Christian tradition, then they come from Hinduism, they come from African spiritualities, they come from Egyptian spiritualities that are thousands of years old. And so a lot of comparative religion scholars understand many Black Madonna shrines to be a Christianized version of some of these older religious, or not just Christianized, but really a Catholic version of some of these older Christian and or non-Christian traditions. And so I think it's incredibly helpful. And a lot of the research that I've done on the Black Madonna comes out of the Coptic tradition, because in spoken and unspoken ways, they understood Mary, the Mother of God, to be a Black woman. And a lot of the prayers that they have about her speak to the Black Madonna.
Great. And so our next question was, what types of representations of the Black Madonna are present in the sacred art of Black majority nations that have Catholic influence? So they gave the example of Haiti and other Caribbean countries and African nations.
So what I've discovered is sobering, because while there are images of the Black Madonna on the continent of Africa, in the African diaspora, more often than not, when you see Catholicism and the role that it's played in colonialism, you see white Marys. And so even though there's a really famous Black Madonna in Rwanda, in Kigali, Rwanda, there are many, many, many more white Madonnas in Rwanda. And so like I've discovered as I've worked to understand the Black Madonna, you're constantly having to uncover what colonialism has brought to the conversation.
Okay, and while I'm waiting on some,
they're a lot more rare than I would like to see, than I would hope for. I'll say that.
And while we're waiting on potential other questions from the audience, I'll go ahead and ask my question. So, wow, I was really moved by the story of Our Lady of the Sick, who you referred to as she who cherishes our hot mess. I really love that. And something you said, actually tied to my question, you said, I can be a mess and still be sacred. And that statement ties to an area of research that I am currently digging at, which is how do we experience this remembering, literally the remembering of our bodies, when we think about the experience of the diaspora, which we know is historically marked by fragmentation and brokenness, right? The broken memories, broken bodies. And as Black women, you and I as Black women who live in the African diaspora in the Americas, we have inherited a collective history of that fragmentation. And so I'm curious, how do we think about Mary aiding us in the diaspora in that remembering process? So I was just really moved by what you said.
Oh, thank you for that question. So one of the things I've noticed in a lot of decolonial spaces is how colonial they are. And one of the ways this shows up, even with people who are explicitly trying to heal from colonialism, like me, one of the ways this shows up is in a need for perfection as we heal. We want to heal quickly. We want to heal right. We don't want to cause any harm in our healing. We want it to be cute and succinct. And there's this, I love Julietta Singh's work on unlearning mastery in the colonial imagination, because we've been taught that we have to master everything. And this is something that even people in the diaspora who are intentionally trying to heal still struggle with. And so my thought was, okay, I finally found the Black Madonna. Now I need to master it so I can master myself, so that my body's no longer messy, my identity is no longer messy, and I was reading Wahid yesterday while I was getting my hair twisted, and I started crying while I was like at the salon, because she, in one of her poems, she said, how can you possibly be a daughter if you don't have a mother tongue? And I just wept. Because our identities are fragmented. And it's so, of course, I'm going to be messy as I'm trying to do this healing work with myself and also with others. And we don't often acknowledge that as part of the process and sacred. Instead, we shame ourselves. We try to master ourselves. We try to quiet ourselves. We try to bring order to organizing. A bunch of people organizing who are all fragmented. We're supposed to do it in this really perfect way. And so I think the Black Madonna and the way that she has been decapitated herself, the way that it took her years for her body to be reconnected again. The fact that it was a community, it was a community participatory process says so much about how we can be complicated and we can have identities that are fragmented and we can be motherless and we can be broken, and we don't have to do it all on our own, and we don't have to be ashamed of that. That's what I think is so powerful. She's holding it. She held it for herself. She holds it for all. And also we can hold it for others. And one of the things that has come out of my theology on this particular Black Madonna is the role that we can play in communities that are based on mutual nurturing and not the absence of need. Usually, and you can probably speak to this, Larissa, in academia, it's the people who look like they have it all together and somehow against all odds still kill it and nail it, that get promoted, that get the grants, that get to do things. And so the matriarchal way of not building community based on what people produce, but building community based on mutual nurturing is the way that we can live out our theology. And that starts with myself, right? Nurturing myself, giving myself grace, but then also allowing for there to be space and messiness when I'm trying to work with other people who are also on their healing journeys.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Thank you so much. And I just thought of, she's not a Black Madonna, but she is another enculturated Madonna, Our Lady of Guadalupe, as an image of a Madonna who aids in this remembering process for Juan Diego, specifically, as an Aztec person who is a victim of colonialism, and how she meets him in that brokenness and she aids in that remembering process. So I thought about her. And our last question, which actually closes out the series, but also ties to the series, is, do you think that the act of making actual pilgrimage, whether to a Black Madonna site or not, can aid and support us in the work for social justice, in the work of healing, and in the work of liberation?
Absolutely. I mean, going back to Kelsey Blackwell's work on decolonizing the body, it's in connecting to our bodies that the power for liberation lies. And we can do that in our home. We can do that on a walk with Girl Trek. We can do that walking to class. pilgrimage doesn't have to be this wild, expensive, harrowing journey. It's really just embodied spirituality and allowing the journey to speak to us. Not as the journey not being a destination, but the journey just being valuable in and of itself, which is another thing that the Black Madonna speaks to in her nonlinear way. So yeah, I love the idea of Black people getting into their bodies. And, it could be Afro, it could be outdoor Afro, which, it doesn't even have to be inherently spiritual. It can just be, I'm just out in nature connecting. And then what arises in my body as I just notice, like I don't have to analyze, I can just notice, wow, I'm breathing more deeply out here. Let me look around. What's happening or what's not happening here that's facilitating this breath? And how can I be more intentional about connecting with that and ushering other people into connecting?
Dr. Cleveland, thank you so much for this really just edifying and wonderful presentation today. We have learned so much from you, and I'm honored to have moderated this event. So that closes out the end of our Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.